There is a particular kind of exhaustion that does not show up on any medical chart. It does not register in blood work or sleep studies. It lives somewhere quieter than the body and somewhere louder than the mind, in that interior place where a woman has spent years, sometimes decades, deciding how much of herself is acceptable to bring into a room. Perhaps you know this exhaustion. Perhaps you have felt it not at the end of a long day, but at the beginning of one, that low, familiar weight of already calculating. Before you have even spoken your first word to another person, how to make yourself easier, how to take up less, how to need less, want less, ask for less, how to arrive at the edges of your own life and call it grace. In today's audiobook, we explore the quiet and often invisible process of self-erasure. The Heart of You Were Never Too Much, published by Unchained Heart. In these pages, we go beyond the surface, inviting you to sit with what this theme truly means in your own life, not to fix it, not to overcome it in 10 simple steps, but to finally see it, to trace it back to where it began, to understand why it made sense when it did, and to begin, gently and honestly, to loosen its hold. This is a book about the woman who makes herself small, who learned, somewhere along the way, that her fullness was a problem to be managed, who discovered in the rooms where she grew up, or in the arms of someone who should have been safe, that the cost of taking up space was too high, and who has been paying that cost ever since, often without realizing she is still paying it. You are not broken. You are not weak. You are someone who adapted brilliantly, in fact, to an environment that could not hold all of you. And those adaptations, which once kept you safe, have stayed long past their invitation. In the chapters ahead, Eleanor will walk beside you through the rooms where the shrinking first began. In our first chapter, we trace the origin of this wound, the early environment where you learn to read every mood before your own, where love felt conditional and presence felt dangerous. In our second chapter, we explore how that wound quietly shaped the woman you became, how a child's survival strategy became an adult's identity, so seamlessly that the seam disappeared entirely. In our third chapter, we sit with the patterns this created in your relationships, the invisible contracts, the erased limits, the chronic giving that always somehow felt like it was not quite enough. In our fourth chapter, we turn to the body, because the body has been keeping score all along, holding every suppressed no, every swallowed feeling, every moment you smiled when you wanted to weep. In our fifth chapter, we begin the tender and non-linear process of unchaining, not a dramatic transformation, but the first honest breath of a woman beginning to remember who she was before she learned to disappear. And in our sixth and final chapter, we allow ourselves to imagine, quietly and without pressure, what life might feel like when there is finally room for all of you. Before we begin, a small and genuine invitation. If this voice, this space, this way of sitting with what is difficult, feels like something you have been looking for, I would love for you to follow the Unchained Heart channel. Every week, a new audiobook arrives in this same spirit, unhurried, honest, and made entirely for you. You will find the follow button just below this video. And now, with that said, let us begin gently at the root of this. Chapter 1. The Room Where You First Learned to Disappear. Chapter 1. The room where you first learned to disappear. There is a particular kind of home, and it does not have to have been cruel to have done this to you, where a child learns, very early, that the emotional weather of the adults around her is her responsibility to manage. Not in any way that was ever spoken aloud. No one sat her down and said, "Your feelings are secondary here. Your needs will create a burden. Your loudness, your brightness, your need for attention is more than we can hold." No one needed to say it. She felt it the way children always feel the things that are never said, in the silences, in the sighs, in the way a parent's eyes shifted when she asked for something, in the way the temperature of a room changed when she cried. Some of these homes were chaotic, loud with conflict, unpredictable. The kind of environment where a child learns to be very still and very small, because stillness and smallness are the closest things available to safety. Some of these homes were quiet in a different way, emotionally cool, achievement-oriented, where feelings were considered indulgent and vulnerability was not quite acceptable. Some seemed, from the outside, perfectly ordinary. And that is perhaps the most disorienting kind, because when the home looks fine, the child grows up doubting her own experience. She learns not only to shrink her needs, but to shrink the very perception that she has needs at all. What all of these homes have in common is this: they could not hold the full emotional life of the child who lived there. And the child, as children always do, adapted. She became what the environment required. She became the one who noticed everyone else's moods before her own. She became helpful, agreeable, quiet, easy. She learned to scan a room the way a sailor scans the sky, always reading the signs, always adjusting, always making the interior calculation of how much of herself was currently safe to show. This is not a flaw. It is a form of extraordinary intelligence. A child who learns to read emotional atmospheres with precision is a child who is doing everything she can to navigate an environment that would otherwise be overwhelming. She is not weak. She is adaptive. She is, in her own small and wordless way, surviving. But survival strategies do not come free. The price of this particular one is that the child begins to lose access to her own interior world. When you spend all of your attention tracking what others need, feel, and want, your own needs, feelings, and wants begin to go quiet. Not gone, they are never gone, but quieter. Pushed to the side. Learn to be patient, then learn to be silent, then learned, finally, to feel like they were never really there. And here's where it becomes complicated. Because the very act of becoming what the environment requires often brings its rewards. The agreeable child gets praised. The helpful child is called mature. The one who never causes a scene is called easy, and easy becomes a kind of identity. She feels, perhaps for the first time, that she is acceptable, that she is lovable. But the love and acceptance are not quite for her. They are for the version of her that takes up less space. And she learns, without anyone ever saying it, that there is a correlation between her smallness and her worth. This is the root. This is where it began. Not in drama or disaster, but in the quiet daily learning of a child who simply needed to be loved and found that the most reliable path to something resembling love was to make herself easier to love, which meant making herself less. Chapter 2. The Woman the Wound Built. Chapter 2. The Woman the Wound Built. At some point, the child becomes a woman. She moves through the world with what feels like a personality, a character, a set of preferences and responses that feel entirely her own. She does not know, she cannot know, not yet, that much of what she calls herself is not quite herself at all. It is the architecture the wound built, the identity that formed in the shape of the absence. There is a particular kind of woman who walks into a room and immediately, almost unconsciously, begins reading it. Who is comfortable? Who needs something? Where is the tension? What can she do to ease it? She is often described as perceptive, intuitive, warm. She is all of those things. But she is also running a very old program, one that was installed long before she had any say in the matter. One that tells her the same thing it always has. Your worth is located in your usefulness. Your belonging is conditional. Stay small, stay helpful, stay easy, and you will be safe. This woman often struggles to know what she wants. Not in a vague philosophical sense. She may know that she wants peace, connection, meaning. But in the small, daily, practical sense, where would you like to go for dinner? What do you need right now? What would make you happy in this moment? There is often a strange blankness, a hesitation, a reflex to look outward before looking inward, to gauge what others want before she allows herself to even locate what she might want. Because for years, what she wanted was not the relevant question. The relevant question was always, what does this situation require of me? She often gives more than she receives, not because she is a martyr. She would be horrified by that word, but because giving feels safe and receiving feels dangerous. Receiving requires presence. It requires being seen, being held, being the one at the center of care. And that is a territory that has always felt faintly threatening, faintly presumptuous. Who am I to need this much? She finds it easier to be competent than vulnerable, to handle things than to feel them, to keep moving than to sit still with what is actually happening inside her. She may be extraordinarily emotionally intelligent when it comes to others, and genuinely baffled by her own interior landscape, which has been quiet for so long that it has begun to feel unfamiliar. She apologizes often. Not always in words, sometimes in body language, in the slight curve inward of her posture, in the way she takes up less space at a table, in the way she softens her voice when she disagrees, in the way she phrases a need as a question or an opinion as a hesitant observation. I was just thinking, maybe, if it is not too much trouble. She has learned to enter her own desires through the back door, to arrive at her own truth sideways because coming at it directly has always felt like too much. She's often described by people who love her as the strong one, the one who holds everything together. And she carries this description with a kind of quiet pride that contains, somewhere in its center, an enormous sadness, because she knows, even if she has never quite said it to herself, that the strong one is the one no one worries about. The strong one is the one who does not get to need. And she has been the strong one for so long that she is no longer entirely sure who she would be if she put it down. This is the woman the wound built. She is real. She is capable and warm and often deeply loved. But she is also carrying something that was never hers to carry alone, and beneath the competence, beneath the grace, beneath the ease she offers to everyone around her, there is a woman who has been waiting a very long time for someone to ask how she is, and actually wait for the answer. Chapter 3. The Invisible Contracts. Chapter 3. The Invisible Contracts. Every relationship has two layers. The visible layer is the one both people can see, the agreements that are spoken aloud, the roles that are named, the dynamics that are acknowledged. And then there is the invisible layer, the unspoken contracts, the arrangements that were never negotiated, the rules that govern the relationship without either person ever having agreed to them consciously. For the woman who learned to make herself small, the invisible contracts in her relationships tend to follow a very recognizable pattern. She gives, she accommodates, she adjusts, she absorbs. And somewhere underneath all of that, she waits, often for years, often without quite knowing what she is waiting for the relationship to finally, somehow feel mutual. It rarely does. Not because the people in her life are uniformly unkind. Many of them are not. But because the invisible contract she arrived with established, from the very beginning, that her role was to make things easier for the other person. And people, by and large, accept the terms they are offered. There is a particular pattern that appears in her romantic relationships with quiet consistency. She is drawn often to people who need something from her, who are in some way unfinished, complicated, difficult, or emotionally unavailable. Not because she is foolish, not because she does not see the signs. She often sees them very clearly. But there is something in the dynamic of being needed that feels, to the part of her that was shaped so early, like love. Being needed is familiar. Being needed means she has a place. Being needed means she is not too much, because when someone needs you, your presence becomes a solution rather than a burden. She often stays too long in relationships that are slowly diminishing her. She tells herself she is being patient, loyal, loving. She tells herself that if she is just a little more understanding, a little more consistent, a little more willing to work through the difficulty, the relationship will become what she has always believed it could be. She believes in people's potential more than she trusts her own experience. She has learned to override what she feels in favor of what she hopes. Her limits, the ones she has, are often theoretical. She knows, in the abstract, that there are things she will not tolerate. But in the lived reality of a relationship, those limits tend to expand, to bend, to accommodate, not all at once. That would be too visible. It happens in small increments. One concession that seems reasonable, one compromise that seems generous, one moment of looking the other way that seems kind, and then another, until the original limit is so far behind her that she can barely remember where she started. This is not weakness. This is the direct consequence of having learned, very early, that her no was not safe, that asserting her needs created conflict. That conflict meant the loss of love or approval or peace, So she learned to avoid the conflict by softening the no, by wrapping it in so many qualifications that it barely registered, by learning to say yes when she meant no, and then managing the interior damage of that yes alone, privately, in the quiet after everyone else was satisfied. She gives and gives and gives, and then one day, often without warning, she hits a wall. The giving runs dry. The warmth becomes a kind of numbness. She looks at the relationship she has been tending so carefully and feels something she cannot quite name. Not anger exactly, not resentment exactly, but a kind of hollow bewilderment. I have given everything I had. Why does this still not feel like enough? Why do I still not feel seen? The answer, which is painful and important, is that she was working from an invisible contract that was never in her favor. And no amount of giving, no amount of accommodation, no amount of shrinking herself to fit can fulfill a contract that was written on the premise of her smallness. The relationship did not fail because she did not give enough. It faltered because it was built on an architecture in which she was never quite real, never quite present as a full person with her own weight and needs and truth. This is not the whole story, but it is an important part of it. Chapter 4. What the body has been holding. Chapter 4. What the body has been holding. The mind is very good at managing. The mind can construct narratives, minimize experiences, find silver linings, tell itself that it is fine, that it is not that bad, that others have it worse, that there is no need to make a fuss. The mind can do this for years, decades, sometimes. It can hold the story of a woman who is handling things, who is strong, who has moved on, who does not dwell. The body cannot lie in the same way. The body is not narrative. The body does not have access to the story you tell yourself about what happened and why it was not so bad, and how you are really doing quite well, all things considered. The body works in sensation, in contraction, in the subtle and persistent language of tension and breath, and the particular quality of stillness that is not rest, but vigilance. And for the woman who has spent years making herself small, the body has been keeping an honest account of everything the mind chose to manage away. There is a particular kind of physical holding that many women in this territory know intimately, though they may not have connected it to this. The shoulders that live slightly higher than they should, the chest that is slightly caved inward, as if the body learned to protect its own center. The breath that is shallow, habitual, that rarely reaches all the way down. The jaw that is tight in the morning. The throat that closes when something important needs to be said. The stomach that contracts when someone is unhappy. These are not random. These are the body's record of every suppressed no, every swallowed feeling, every moment when it was not safe to respond authentically to what was happening. When a person regularly overrides her own responses, when she smiles when she wants to cry, when she agrees when every cell of her is refusing, when she stays in a room or a relationship or a situation that everything in her body is saying leave, the nervous system does not simply absorb the contradiction and move on. It records it. It holds it. It builds a kind of tension around the unprocessed experience, a physical parenthesis that stays open because the thing inside it was never allowed to complete itself. Over time, this can present as chronic fatigue that is not explained by sleep deprivation, as an ambient anxiety that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, as a difficulty being fully present in her own body, a slight sensation of living slightly outside herself, as though she is watching her own life from a careful distance, as a numbness that extends beyond emotions, a muting of pleasure as well as pain, a flattening of the interior landscape that was, once, so vivid and alive. There is a particular grief that arrives when a woman begins to reconnect with her body after years of this kind of disconnection. Because the body, when it is finally given permission to thaw, does not offer only relief. It offers everything that was stored there, the tears that were not cried, the anger that was deemed too dangerous, the longing that was called selfish, the grief for the years of choosing smallness because it felt like the only safe option. All of this lives in the body. All of this is waiting not to overwhelm, but to be witnessed. The body is not working against you. This is the important thing to understand. The tightness, the fatigue, the hypervigilance, these are not signs that something is wrong with you. They are signs that something happened to you, and that your body, in its extraordinary loyalty, held it all while you kept going. The body is not broken. It is honest. And for a woman who has spent so much of her life managing the truth, the body's honesty, as uncomfortable as it can be, is actually one of the most important homecomings available to her. Learning to listen to the body is not a dramatic process. It is not necessarily a loud one. It begins in small moments of noticing, the slight tightening in the chest when someone makes a demand, the loosening of the breath when a difficult situation resolves, the particular quality of comfort or discomfort that arises in different rooms, with different people, in different kinds of silence. It is the quiet practice of beginning to trust the body's report over the mind's narrative. She has been carrying this for a long time. And the body is ready, when she is, to begin setting it down. Chapter 5. The First Honest Breath. Chapter 5. The First Honest Breath. There is a moment, and it is rarely dramatic, rarely the cinematic breakthrough we have been led to expect, when something shifts. It might arrive in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. It might come in the quiet after a conversation where, for the first time, she did not apologize for something that was not her fault. It might arrive as a small, strange sensation of solidity, as though she has stepped onto ground that is actually holding her weight. It is not relief, not exactly. It is something quieter and older than relief. It is the first honest breath of a woman beginning to remember who she was before she learned to disappear. This chapter is about that beginning, not the transformation, the beginning. Because the unchaining does not happen all at once, and any voice that tells you otherwise is not being honest with you. It happens in increments, in small reversals of old habits, in the accumulation of moments where she chooses, often with great difficulty and uncertainty, to be a little more true to herself than she was the day before. The first thing that changes is often not behavior, but perception. She begins to notice what she could not see before, the automatic nature of her accommodations, the speed with which she adjusts herself to the emotional weather of others, the way she reaches for the apology before she has even finished assessing whether one is actually warranted. She begins to see the invisible contract, not yet able to renegotiate it perhaps, but able to see it for what it is. And seeing it, naming it, however privately and tentatively, is its own form of freedom. There is a particular quality to the discomfort of this beginning that is worth naming, because it is often mistaken for evidence that something is going wrong. When a woman who has always accommodated begins to hold her ground, even slightly, even imperfectly, there is almost always an interior alarm. It sounds like selfishness. It sounds like cruelty. It sounds like the voices of everyone she ever learned to manage, telling her that her needs are too much, that she is being difficult, that she is making things hard. This alarm is not a signal to stop. It is evidence that she is touching the old wound. It is the contraction that comes just before something long held begins to release. The unchaining does not ask her to become someone else. This is the misunderstanding she may carry into this process, the fear that if she stops shrinking herself, she will become unrecognizable, hard, selfish, alone. In reality, the opposite tends to be true. What she finds, as she begins to take up the space that was always rightfully hers, is not a stranger. It is someone she has always recognized, somewhere very deep and very quiet, someone who has been patient for a very long time, who has not gone anywhere, who has been waiting with remarkable faithfulness for this. She may find that some relationships cannot follow her into this new spaciousness. This is painful, and it deserves to be named honestly rather than wrapped in reassurance. When a woman has built relationships on the implicit promise of her smallness, her expansion can feel threatening to those who depended on her being diminished. This is not her fault, and it does not mean she must return to smallness to preserve what can only be preserved at that cost. She may also find, and this is often the gentler surprise, that some relationships deepen as she becomes more real within them. That the people who were always capable of meeting her fully rise to do so when she stops making herself easy to overlook. That honesty, even when it is uncomfortable, creates a kind of intimacy that accommodation never could. The unchaining is not a destination. It is not a state she will arrive at and then maintain forever without effort. It is a practice. A returning, again and again, to the question, what is actually true for me right now? A slow, patient, imperfect learning of how to let that truth have a voice, in small ways first, and then larger ones. In the way she holds herself in a room, in the way she speaks or does not speak, in the small daily decisions about how much of herself to bring into the world. The first honest breath is just that, a beginning. But beginnings, for women who have been waiting as long as she has, are not small things. Chapter 6. All the room that was always yours. Chapter 6. All the room that was always yours. There is a version of this woman that exists on the other side of the long and non-linear work of unchaining, not a perfected version, not an invulnerable one, but a version that has learned something the smaller version never quite believed, that she was never too much, that the love worth having does not require her diminishment as its condition, that the space she takes up in a room is not a debt she owes anyone an apology for. This chapter is an invitation to imagine that version of herself, not as a goal to achieve by a certain date, not as a standard to measure herself against and find herself lacking, but as a quiet light to orient toward, a direction rather than a destination, a way of understanding what she is moving toward even in the moments when the movement is slow or circular or invisible. The woman who has begun to unchain herself tends to describe a particular experience as one of the most striking aspects of the process, the discovery that her presence, her actual, full, unmitigated presence, is not the burden she was always told it would be, that when she stops managing herself, stops performing ease, stops arriving at her own edges and calling it grace, something unexpected happens in the room she enters. They become more alive. The conversations become more real. The relationships that can hold her fullness become richer than anything she ever experienced while she was performing her smallness. She discovers that she is, in fact, interesting. Not in the superficial sense. She always knew she could perform interest, could be charming and warm and engaging in a way that made other people feel seen. But in the deeper sense, her actual inner life, the one she kept so carefully private, so carefully managed, so carefully hidden beneath the surface of her competence and ease, that interior life, when she begins to allow it some air, turns out to be rich and vivid and worth knowing. She had believed somewhere that there was nothing there or nothing safe, nothing acceptable. She had confused the quieting of herself with the absence of a self. There was always something there. It was just waiting for permission to exist. She begins to notice what she actually wants. This is a stranger and more important discovery than it might sound. For a woman who has spent years outsourcing her own desires, who has said whatever you want and meant it, not as generosity, but as genuine disconnection from her own preferences, the emergence of a want, a real and specific and owned want, is a remarkable thing. It might start small. A preference for one kind of afternoon over another. A recognition that she dislikes something she always pretended to be neutral about. A craving for silence, for music, for a particular kind of conversation that she identifies as hers before she has checked whether it is convenient for anyone else. She learns a different relationship with her own limits. Not the theoretical limits that bent and accommodated and eventually disappeared, but something firmer and less dramatic. A knowledge of where she ends and another person begins. A capacity to say, without excessive apology or elaborate justification, that something is not working for her. This is not hardness. It is not the performance of indifference. It is the quiet and grounded recognition that she is a person, a full and real and specific person, whose needs and feelings and truth are not subordinate to everyone else's comfort. She finds, perhaps for the first time, that she can be alone with herself without the need to fill the silence with productivity or noise or the management of someone else's experience. That her own company, which she avoided for so long because it felt too empty or too full or too much of something she could not name, her own company becomes something she can rest in. Not always easily. Not without the old habits returning sometimes. Without the familiar pull toward making herself useful or necessary or easy. But more and more, There is a quality to her solitude that is not loneliness, but presence. She's beginning to live inside her own life. This is what was always here, waiting beneath the smallness. Not a stranger, not a reconstruction. Just her, finally, honestly, wholly herself. The woman who was never too much. The woman who simply needed the world to stop telling her she was, and needed to stop telling herself, long enough to find out what it felt like to arrive fully into the life that was always hers. Conclusion: throughout these chapters, we have sat with something that most women in this territory have never quite had the language for. Not because it does not exist, but because it exists in a register so intimate, so interior, so daily and unremarkable in its accumulation, that it has often been easier to call it personality than to call it history. To call it who she is, rather than what she learned. To carry it forward as identity rather than examine it as wound. We have traced the root of it, to the early room, to the child who adapted brilliantly and at great cost to an environment that could not hold her whole. We have seen how that adaptation built the woman she became, capable, warm, perceptive, exhausted in ways she could rarely explain or justify. We have walked through the invisible contracts of her relationships, the architecture of her giving, the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who needed her while she quietly disappeared inside that need. We have listened to what the body has been holding, its honest accounting of everything the mind chose to manage, its patient and faithful record of all the suppressed no's and swallowed feelings and moments of choosing. Smallness because it felt like the only safe option. And we have sat with the beginning of something, the first honest breath of unchaining, the tentative and extraordinary discovery that there is room, that there was always room, for all of her. What does this mean for where you are right now? Not in the abstract, in the actual, specific, ordinary circumstances of your life. Perhaps you are somewhere in the middle of this, seeing the patterns for the first time, feeling the particular discomfort of a woman who has started to wake up inside a life she arranged while she was still asleep. Perhaps you are further along and these chapters have named something you have been living but could not quite articulate. Perhaps you are at the very beginning and everything here feels more like a mirror than a map, recognizing the territory without yet knowing how to move through it differently. Wherever you are is the right place to be beginning from. This work does not have a schedule. It does not have a graduation. It is as long and as non-linear as your actual life. Because it is your actual life, the slow and honest and sometimes difficult process of learning to be fully present in it. You were never too much. Not in the childhood home where the weather required your smallness. Not in the relationships where your limits were theoretical and your needs were always the last thing addressed. Not in the body that held everything you were not allowed to feel. You were always exactly enough. You were always exactly all of you. And all of you, the bright and the difficult, and the wanting and the grieving and the becoming, deserves to be here, fully, without apology. Before we part, I want you to know that Unchained Heart has an entire library of audiobooks made in this same spirit for the woman who is quietly, privately, honestly finding her way back to herself. If you follow the channel and turn on notifications, a new audiobook will find you every week in whatever hour you need it most. This community of women is growing, and there is room in it for you. You have carried this long enough, and you are not carrying it alone anymore. If this audiobook has felt like company in the dark, if Eleanor's voice has named something you have been living without quite having the words for, I would love for you to follow Unchained Heart so that we can continue this conversation together in all the weeks ahead. End of the audiobook.